Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Levelling Up digital event hosted by the CMI West Midlands and North West Regional Board. My name's Jamil and I'm a Regional Manager here at CMI, and I'll shortly be handing over to Matt to begin this afternoon's event. If you have any questions during the session, you can ask them using the live chat box on the right of your screen, and we shall answer as many as we can. Today's session is being recorded and it will be shared with you later today for those who book to attend, and will also be available on the CMI website and also the CMI YouTube channel. So now over to Matt Jones, Board Secretary of the CMI West Midlands and North West Regional Board.
Thank you very much, Jamil, and hello everybody, and welcome to our first West Midlands North West seminar event online. So pleasure for you all to join us. So here we are today to talk about a really important topic on levelling up, as kindly Jamil introduced. So as we all understand, the UK suffers from stark regional inequalities. The UK is certainly not alone in this, but we are sadly one of the worst in the developed countries for regional inequalities. And what we're here today to look at is how we might be able to rectify that, or certainly look to address some of these challenges that many of us face. Interestingly, since obviously December 2019, last year, just under a year ago now, when the latest UK election took place, the current government obviously used the political strapline in part to help win that election, and that was obviously based around levelling up in part as well. So again, it's a pleasure to be joined today by two wonderful panelists. We've got ourselves Richard Chorley, who's the Managing Director of Network IT Recruitment. So big welcome to Richard.
Hi.
Hi Richard, how are you doing? Okay. Good to see you. We've handed over to Richard shortly. We've also got Steve Haywood, and he's the Managing Director of Recruitment. So again, hello, Steve. Well, welcome to today's seminar. Okay, so as I say, my name's Matt. I'm the current Board Secretary for the CMI West Midlands North West region. I also am a Deputy Director at the University of Warwick in a specific department, WMG. So that's basically a quick introduction to ourselves here. The format, just before handing over to our speakers, it's going to last approximately 60 minutes. Obviously, Steve and Richard will be asked a series of questions to begin with, and I'll have a couple of minutes to respond to each. Halfway through the webinar, we'll be taking questions from our live audience and obviously seeing how we get through them. So I'm just going to hand briefly first to Richard for him to do a quick introduction, and then shortly to Steve before we start our first question. So Richard, over to you for a nice introduction. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much. Yeah, my name's Richard Chorley. I've worked in the IT recruitment sector for nearly 20 years now, covering in the main the Midlands, working across public sector and private sector organisations. So hopefully I can offer today an insight from where I sit within the UK in terms of the skills out there in demand and some of the challenges that we know we all face.
Fantastic. Thank you, Richard. Really, really exciting. And over to you, Steve. How about that?
Yeah, similar to Richard, we're actually sort of sister companies, as it were, part of Pertemps Network Group. So we have that sort of UK coverage as a group in whole. 30 years experience, that will explain the hair loss in the same sector. So I think we're very much coming at this from what we are seeing in terms of skill shortages, the regional inequalities, and also sort of technical inequalities that we see, and the challenges that our sector and industry face whilst looking, at the wider economic picture.
No, thank you very much, both of you. That's really interesting. And of course, being in the West Midlands and the North West region, we are the second largest UK region for the CMI. It's obviously a big patch, quite a diverse geography, I guess. We've got two major cities, obviously Birmingham and Manchester, not necessarily in any particular order. And obviously, we've got everything in between of that. So that nicely brings us on to our first question for you to consider. And I'm going to go to Richard first, if that's okay with this. So first question then is, what do regional inequalities mean to you, Richard? And obviously in a minute to Steve. And for those of us living in the West Midlands Northwest region and obviously other regions in the UK as well. So just to repeat that, what do regional inequalities mean to you? And Richard, if I can, I'll go to you first.
Okay, so I'm conscious of trying to answer this as succinctly as possible. I think, firstly, I would say to me, in my day job, I'm working with organisations And it's clear that a vast majority or a number of the key skills that I look for within the technology sector sit in certain regions of the UK. And therefore, there is an inherent challenge to find people outside of those regions for clients. So on a professional basis, on a day-to-day basis, I see and feel regional inequality. And then from a personal perspective, you see it, don't you? You see it in the press, you see it in everything you read, and in the world you live in. There is a clear focus or a clear divide between the main cities, the main centres within the UK, and those post-industrial areas, the regions outside of them. Matt, does that answer the question?
No, thank you, Richard. It's a really good starting place, and it is obviously, as you say, a very diverse topic, and certainly a lot of interest. And thank you for sharing that. So, before we move forward, we'll go to Steve. So, just a quick reminder, Steve, of the question again, as we were just speaking to Richard there. What do regional inequalities mean to you, and also the people living in these regions that we speak about?
Yeah, I think as a southerner who moved north 20 years ago, but I spend a lot of time traveling with work and with clients in the south. You realise that reach in the southeast, the reach of London, and how big an economic benefit that has for large areas of the south. Not all, and particularly if you move out to the sort of the southwest regions and the like. But we very much see it, and again we see it in the northwest. And I think particularly, we talk of COVID at the moment, the impact that's had and the sort of recessionary impact that can have. Looking at areas, particularly Merseyside at the moment, very much hospitality driven. We have this very much a service driven economy, and it's been stripped by COVID, and it shows that inequality. And that then brings the snowball effect of a lack of earnings and therefore a lack of demand in the hospitality sector. And onwards it travels downwards. So I think we certainly we feel that, and that the lack of support some areas have. Saying that, there are certain positives. Again, with Merseyside in particular, there's quite a lot of reach in terms of public sector jobs around Passport Office, HMRC, CSA. So I think more, the value of decentralising is exemplified there. And I think if we can see that more, it can only be to the benefits of particular regions outside of London and the south.
No, thank you very much, Steve and Richard. Again, fascinating conversation. So again, when we look at levelling up, a lot of the work around the back of this was about differences in certainly in one measure around gross domestic product, or GDP. So obviously there's a recognition, certainly within the UK, that London typically has the lion's share of GDP, and unfortunately the regions have less so. So I think we're starting to get into the crux of that. So thank you both, first of all, for that first question. If we just look at our second question then, so I mean, prior to COVID-19, if we can sort of cast our minds back to the beginning of the year, and certainly afterwards, the Open University did a study, and they reported that 91% of organisations in the UK struggle to find workers with the right skills. And that's obviously quite a shocking statistic, 91%. So, and again, a further report looked at by the year 2030, so less than sort of 9 years away, potentially from where we are at the moment, as much as 14% of the global workforce may need to switch occupations to things like digitalization, automation, advances in AI, etc. So it's quite fortunate, I guess, you guys are working in the tech sector, because obviously this is potentially leading the charge in this. But the question, I guess, if we don't, we'll go the other way around this time. We'll start with yourself, Steve, if that's okay. So question 2 then for you both is, thinking about the role of skills and skills gaps, so skills and skills gaps. What future skills do we need to see in our regions for basically now and the coming decade? So I don't know what you thought about that, first of all, Steve. Current skills and future skills that we need to be thinking about.
Yeah, again, I think sort of tech sector specific to us, we even though we are in a general recessionary economy, our market is still, the demand in our market is still pretty strong, and the skills gap is fairly large. we are not seeing we're not seeing the supply of individuals that we need to satisfy the areas within IT, with tech, and obviously automation, digitization. This is only going to get worse. So I think, you know, we have the added situation with Brexit. We certainly see certain supply from Eastern Europe. We get a lot of guys in from Asia as well. And I think, again, it's really looking more now at homegrown talent and what we can do, and what we can do quickly to try and bridge this. And particularly that I think we have that gap in terms of getting work fit and moving from good grads, people coming through the education system, but bridging that gap, because typically, you know, our employers are looking for the 18 months to 3 years type experience before they're really considering people. And how can we bridge that gap?
No, fascinating. Thank you very much, Steve. Very insightful. So again, Richard, similar question to you, of course. What sort of skills are you looking for as well? I mean, obviously, Steve spoke about quite a few there. So what skills now, maybe what skills are sort of future employers and the regions looking for over the next decade in your view as well?
As I say, well, this is my personal view. If you look at the UK historically, we moved from heavy industry, we moved to become a service sector, but we've always retained the specialist engineering element, and we've become specialists in what we do. We won't compete, I suppose. I'm sure people will argue the point, but I don't think we'll compete in heavy industry. So, how do we equip our current generation and our future? Well, technology sits at the heart of most things today, doesn't it? So we've got to equip everybody with technology skills. The skills gap that I personally see on a day-to-day basis, there's a massive skills gap within certain specialism areas of engineering, be that electrical and mechanical. So we need to focus on bolstering those and getting more people into that area of education with practical experience, as Steve says. From a technology perspective, with or without COVID, there's a massive shortage of certain skills within the technology sector. And it has been untouched by recession and by COVID. So, and they are the people that create or will create or continue to create the technology that will bring us competitive advantage, run our systems, run our companies, run our homes, and run our lives in many ways. So there is a skills gap. So we need to focus on looking and identifying what those core skills are, me personally, within technology, and getting our education system up to speed, because I think it sits a little bit behind the curve because technology is moving so quickly. So somehow we need to get our education system up to and aligned with the demands of our society today and world, if that's not too grandiose to say, because I think it's sitting just behind the curve and it needs to move up. So things are changing a little bit too slowly to close that gap at this point. Hopefully that answers the question from my view.
Yeah, no, terrific. Really interesting from both yourself and Steve there about the skills, what's needed, and more importantly, how to get them. And I think some of the challenges that the region faces in trying to acquire those skills as well, because obviously there seems to be a bit of a gap, as you mentioned there, Richard, between what's currently being available and how we deliver those skills. Again, you mentioned universities as one of the tools to do that, and maybe there are improvements that we need to bring forward to try to address that. So I think we might come back to that topic in a short while. So the next question kind of touches on what we were just discussing there. So cities such as Burnley, that's obviously within our region, we've got Sunderland that sits outside our region, and Birmingham. So Burnley and Birmingham are certainly within our region there. They've had at least a quarter of their workforce go because of COVID onto the job retention scheme, which is quite significant. 20-25% there as at least go on to that job retention team. And again, I think it picks up slightly on what Steve and yourself were saying there, Richard, earlier about the nature of our region as well, and the sort of the heavy manufacturing base it's coming from, which might partially explain that. So COVID-19's had potentially a devastating impact upon health. Certainly, we've seen that on a sort of day-to-day basis, but perhaps more significant as well, the other side, which is the economy. And regions with a high concentration, we've got automotive, I've got transport manufacturing. Again, that's certainly not been unaffected by COVID, to say the least. And many of those workers, sadly, at the moment, might not necessarily be able to work from home, given their sort of the nature of that work. So I guess, first of all, Richard, if we can turn to you first, if that's okay on this one, how might, for example, things like devolution help regional leaders, first of all, try to address some of these regional economic challenges? And a second part to this question, what sort of advice would you give to regional mayors, whether that be, Andy Street or, Andy Burnham, wherever we might be? What sort of advice would you give to them? So first question, of course, is how might sort of devolution help leaders address some of these regional challenges that we're experiencing? So then after you, I'll turn to Steve, if that's okay.
Well, I think the argument, and it's very succinct. The succinct answer to this is that the power sits in a place that's some way back from the front line. So devolution will allow a greater regional focus. And Steve and I have discussed this in anticipation of the conversation. So I'm going to leave, if I may, I'll leave that because I think Steve will cover that very well in how he's going to answer this. But the regional focus focuses on regional challenges and making those regions more effective places people want to be, want to live, and therefore you retain people in those spaces, in those regions. Excellent. So it is essential to me that some element of devolution, and I'm no politician, but some regional focus is really given and some power is given so that problems and focus is specific to that region. It's done in real time. Because again, from being centralized, it takes some time to come down the pipeline. The message is somewhat muddied a little bit on the way. And to my view, it's less effective. If you've got control and focus at a regional level, a devolved level, it'll be far more effective. And it will reduce the movement of people in the long term to the major cities, because it will make their hometowns, those areas, more effective, more efficient, better places to be. There's no need to move. So it will then level it up. What was the second part of the question? May I ask, Matt? Sorry.
No, sorry. No, and thank you for that response. Yeah, it was also about what advice you would offer to some of the regional mayors. So, I mean, obviously, if Andy Street was kind enough to join us right now, for example, what advice might you give him? Certainly, with his re-election potentially pending later next year. I mean, what does he need to be saying to get you on board, as it were?
Focus. Find your champions at the grassroots levels and focus. Pull a team together on a regional basis and focus on your region, and then talk to your peer group and get them to work together.
Got you. No, that's really good advice.
More control. To me, more control.
No, thank you, Richard. Really insightful again. So, Steve, again, similar sort of question there. So, how might devolution potentially help leaders address some of these economic challenges? Was the first part of the question.
Well, I think there's sort of picking up on the thread that Richard ran with. To a degree, it's about passion, isn't it? It's about having passion for whatever it may be, and surely individual regional leaders are more passionate about their areas than central government. So I think it's finding that drive, getting almost the siege mentality, because we're seeing a little bit with Scotland at the moment. Again, I know it's been a bit pushed by the whole COVID scenario, but I think that there's very much a thrust on not just devolution, but independence with Scotland, and I think because they feel as though maybe they're handling things better than the central government is, rightly or wrongly. So I think getting that siege mentality. I love a football analogy, and I'm not a Man United fan, but look at Alex Ferguson back in the day. That was absolutely his sort of MO, was to drive this everybody's against us, and we'll show them. And I think Andy Burnham showed a little bit of that in some of the negotiations in the sort of prior lockdown situation. And I think garnered quite a lot of support. Again, putting politics aside, I think getting that sort of sense of us and them can only be a good thing, because as Rich touched on, if there is opportunity then locally, some of the stats that we've looked into around graduates in Liverpool, in Manchester, in Chester, in this area, down in Birmingham, not staying at the end of their courses because there just aren't the opportunities, then maybe the opportunities will exist. They will stay, and again, that is a form of levelling up. And I think as well, you know, on a local level, you touched on Birmingham, Burnley. It was actually named in the FT as one of the country's top tech towns, and that's been very much driven by a group of business leaders called Burnley Bondholders. And you know what they're looking to do is sort of create this thriving, vibrant destination, attracting and retaining talent. So again, I think if there's a weakness in the economy, it is because a lot of jobs are back to this sort of hospitality sector. And that's where we need to be looking to reposition. I mean, certainly to our benefit, if we saw more coming through on the tech side, but I think in general, it's the benefits of the local communies.
No, that's really fascinating. Go on, Richard. Sorry.
Can I just interject? Sorry. To me, you know, COVID's had a massive impact, but it's also had an opportunity. And I would be saying to the local to the mayors, to the local councils, look what it has changed, and that is the ability to people work from home, work remotely. You know, so it's demonstrated that you can work from your region, and that you don't necessarily need to be in a major conurbation. And I'm sure we'll see a movement of people now over the coming years out of the cities potentially. So I would say to them, grab this opportunity, because you've got some real live data, some real data on a major scale. Sorry.
Absolutely, Richard. No, thank you very much. I'm just reflecting on what you both were saying there, and it's quite fascinating, certainly for those of us that were able to work from home, I suppose, first of all. Given that, I suppose, in a way, COVID's been an opportunity, perhaps, for certain instances where we can, you know, work more from home, maybe so now than was ever possible before. It could be quite interesting how, going forward, things like GDP are measured, because if you work for an organisation that might happen to have the head office based in London, but all of that activity is now done remotely because of home working, you know, which region picks that output sort of connectivity up? I didn't know what, very quickly, you thought on that as a potential prospect going forward.
Well, I certainly wouldn't want to try and measure it, but yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, we all sat, I think, as a country with a degree of trepidation back in March, April, as to where this was going to be, and certainly as business owners, they were worrying times. Both of our businesses provide contract personnel. Clearly, whilst there was a complete drop-off in demand initially for any permanent recruitment, whilst companies took stock, I think what we did see were the majority of our contract personnel moving from 1 or 2 days a week at home to a full 5, and sort of pretty much business as usual. And I think Rich has made the point previously around this has enabled IT to be seen sort of front and centre of business, hasn't it, Rich?
Yeah, 100%. It's interesting because it's very. I appreciate the people who'll be listening to this. You know, if you work in manufacturing, in heavy industry, you can't take that process home. I understand that. So, but I suppose from where we sat, if you take an average job now, we get people applying from the south because they're willing to go home. They're willing to go back because they can work remotely. So it's actually opening up our ability to recruit into the regions. It's been very positive. Now, I appreciate that you can't pick up a manufacturing plant and move it to a home base. I understand that. So my focus locally would be how do we attract, and I know it's being done, but how do we genuinely attract manufacturing to our area? And I don't know all the answers. I don't know, because there's been investment areas and this thing's been done historically. But again, with a real local focus and being able to feed that into government, I'm sure we can find a way forward.
No, really interesting points from both Richard and Steve there, and bringing that through. Sorry, go on, Richard. Apologies. Thank you.
It's not the risk. We've got to introduce into our regions. You know, if you take Birmingham or whatever, you've got big Jaguar Land Rover, big manufacturing, and so when that stopped, it was catastrophic. If we have more varied, wider businesses in each region, then it's less of an impact if one has a difficult time. I mean, it's obvious, isn't it? But exciting, quite exciting. I think it's quite an exciting time.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Richard and Steve there. And again, agreed. I think we need a diverse regional economy, and I think it needs to be led locally. And I think that's certainly some of the strong messages coming through. So I just want to turn our attention very quickly back to skills. But before we do that, again, when we look at the current situation, 18 to 24-year-olds in particular, so those just really entering the world of, you know, both work and potentially education, they've been identified as one of the hardest group hit by the economic contraction that we've seen. And there was a report recently by the Resolution Foundation, which again suggested that the lowest paid and some of the youngest in society were disproportionately, furloughed more and potentially more at risk. So I suppose, first of all, just before we move off to skills more broadly, about young people, what if you were, I don't know, if you could go back in time, you were back to being sort of 16, 17, 18, or, you know, you're in that age group now, what advice would you give to those people of that age now, given what we've said previously about future skills, etc.? What should people be looking to do now to make themselves more future-proof? Do you want to kick us off, Steve?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, this is again back to this systemic weakness in the economy, isn't it? A lot of poorly qualified individuals are being, you know, almost hoovered up within the service sector. Particularly the hospitality sector, and very vulnerable then to drops in demand and as we're seeing at the moment, sort of mass unemployment. You hark back to Tony Blair's sort of education cry 14 years ago. And what we saw, whilst we saw plenty of graduates come through the system, we don't see enough in our sector of good tech graduates. We see plenty of good tech graduates coming through from Asia, but we're not seeing enough come through the UK system, local homegrown talent. And I think that needs to be an area that's looked at, but it's not just education. I think, you know, the less focus on exams per se, and maybe more focus on you know, the sort of skills for life. Strong academic background doesn't always mean that, you know, that these individuals are equipped to go into work, and we get a lot of complaints or comments, should I say, from employers where, you know, people are sort of lacking that sort of demonstrating the self-initiative and real desire and drive to actually fill a role successfully. And I think we need to look at that more rather than it be purely just driven by exams.
No, that's really fascinating, and I want to probably come back to that in a minute. But just before we do, Richard, just on the same sort of question about young people, what advice would you give them, like Steve there?
It's an interesting one because it's a conversation that takes place in my house on a reasonably regular basis. I've got one coming up to GCSEs. You know, it's the choices. It's that point of choice in life, isn't it? Yeah. I think, in a nutshell, because I'm conscious of time, it's about gaining practical experience. You find something that's practically based. There's a natural movement or a discussion around going to university, and I appreciate it's part of life and evolves you as an individual. But maybe there should be a focus on what alternatives there are and what the benefits of those are. And that would come from government, that would come back from the schools even. You know, schools seem to be focused very much on exam-based learning, and it benefits some and not others. And I think we lose good people because they can't write down an exam. Some of the best engineers aren't the best people to write an essay, but they have an ability to think and visualize something, you know, that others won't. So I think we're failing in many ways, a lot of good people, because we stay with these rather traditional methods of examining and testing people. So what would I say to them? Find out what you enjoy, actually, would be my answer. Find out what you enjoy. You'll never work a day in your life. But aside from that, I would look around the technology space. I would look at the emerging areas, and I would try and find an educational course that played to my or their capabilities. So whether that's an exam-based course if they're good at exams, or something practically based if they're a practically minded person.
Sure. No, that's really powerful stuff, and especially with you having a sort of a personal related experience of this very topic, it brings us back to what we were talking about before. Then, with sort of skills, generally speaking, and this idea that if we can somehow address the skills gaps, and the levelling up agenda might become slightly easier at the region. So, I suppose a general question then is around things like apprenticeships, and we obviously the UK's had apprenticeships. It's now got degree apprenticeships, which we kind of brought in around 2015, 2016. But I wanted to sort of just pause there and just take your views on this. I mean, obviously, you've got your own sector views to comment on, but as well more broadly, do we think that we need to be re-looking at the education system then to try to get these skills in? Because I know Steve's mentioned in previous conversations, which you might be able to touch on, where, if you had two people applying for a job and one had, a great academic record and one perhaps had a more, experience-based record, but not necessarily strong on the academic side, which would be the stronger candidate on the day? And I was very curious to find out what you both thought on that.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I'm a big believer in the practical experience side, and I think it's something Rich and I have talked about previously. We do a lot of calls and meets with other companies within our group. Hoopside has quite a diverse section of the recruitment market within the Per-Temps network group, and everybody is at that sort of professional level particularly crying out for experienced people, and that doesn't have to come just by going to university. And I did a degree, I had a fantastic time, and I'm delighted and glad I did, but at the end of it took me 18 months, 2 years to really find my feet within a business. And I think if you can combine and give more kudos, I think the real key, more kudos to apprenticeships. There seems to be a certain level of snobbery in terms of apprenticeships and what they offer, what they bring. Is it a cheap labour alternative in some people's eyes? I don't know. And I think we need to almost rip it up and start again to ensure that it's seen as an offering where people get genuine work experience. Spoke to a friend of mine whose son is working with London Underground at the moment. He wasn't particularly academic, getting fantastic experience right across the business, and surely that's engendering loyalty to them as an organisation, whilst turning out a really well-rounded individual who can offer quite a bit to them going forward. But we don't hear enough of that, and we certainly, I don't think Rich and I come across enough of that in our sector, where, back to what we touched on with grads, it's bridging that gap between finishing and then being the finished article, if you like, if there isn't a natural grad program within a company. So more companies looking at how they structure their recruitment to perhaps take on board individuals who, they have a path into that next stage.
Fascinating, Steve. No, thank you very much. And Richard, quickly for you, what's your view on apprenticeships then? Do we need to improve that process somehow? What changes would you look to make? Is it good at the moment? And I suppose both of you, sort of a similar question. Obviously, the Germany as a country, the sort of the German model, if you like, has a much more balanced, perhaps, education system. Again, what's your thinking around that in relation to levelling up? Does that help, perhaps?
Just to answer your first question, although things have evolved, because when I started out in recruitment some 20 years ago, an apprenticeship was seen as the poor relation, without any question. It has evolved. There's been no question about that. It's changed, and you see academically well-qualified people taking on apprenticeships. Yeah. But look, it's not. There's still a stigma. There's still a perception, there's still a stigma. And the number of calls I receive from great, well-qualified graduates, be it university, college or whatever, but at their point in life, well educated, without any experience, saying, what do I do? And it's chicken and egg. So let's go back to regions, because we're here to talk about leveling up. If I was a regional, I would try and find in my region, I would try and create some educational centres that gain a reputation for delivering apprenticeship, experience-based education. Because I think people will travel into those areas to undertake that, as long as there's some communication around that movement and that change and that positive upselling of experience-based education. Forget calling it apprenticeships. Let's call it experience-based education. Let's move us to that, because and let's get to those people that aren't being spoken to.
Yeah,
because they don't fit the traditional. Because there's some real talent out there. And it's all it's deep in our system, in our psyche, that education, traditional education, is the answer.
No worries. Thank you very much, both of you. Again, just in the interest of time, just moving the conversation on a little bit. Funny enough, just this very week. So again, it just shows you how topical leveling up as a conversation is at the moment, and probably will continue to be for many months, many years to come. So there's a report by RSM and the sort of Make UK rather, that basically said 4 in 10 manufacturers wanted to see a greater local emphasis when it came to things like infrastructure projects. I'm just thinking of ones at the moment, such as like HS2, which is considered more of a nationally driven initiative versus more local ones. So taking that then, if we were kindly joined today by somebody like Prime Minister Boris Johnson, he might be watching, who knows. What advice would you give him today about how to accelerate addressing levelling up then? I mean, what would be your sort of takeaway message, if there was one, to Boris?
To me, I would say to him that he needs a representative in his cabinet that looks after specifically this area of discussion, and that to do it effectively, you can't do it 6 miles behind the back line, which is where metaphorically speaking, that's where I think we're sat at the moment. So we need to build up some presence in the regions that can feed real-time data back to make decisions quicker and more effective and immediate. That's what I'd say to him. To achieve what he needs to, and he has to, politics alone, if he doesn't achieve on it, he won't be Prime Minister, because he will lose all the votes he's gained. Yeah, but you can't manage this from a centre isn't close to the coalface. We need to get some real data, some real regional data from the coalface into the decision-making process.
Yeah, no, thank you, Richard. And Steve, I mean, again, obviously, we could discuss this for hours, I guess, couldn't we? But if Boris was here now, what would your advice be to him?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, similar lines, and actually going back to just quickly what you mentioned, Germany, and it's something we've got another company within group who deals specifically with Germany. Rich and I sort of spoke to the MD there to see what they sort of experience in their marketplace. And a point he made was that there's absolute devolution in Germany. Berlin, the differences between the major regions and cities and Berlin is minimal compared to what we're experiencing here. And it's a certain irony as we turn away from Europe that we should really be looking at it to provide us with a blueprint. But I think, that is absolutely what it's all about. It's a combination of public sector devolution, it's regional hubs, encouraging private enterprise initiatives. I think politically, this Northern Research Group band of Conservative MPs who have got together again, as Rich said, I think there will be pressure regionally from the MPs that are being voted in, because clearly they're very much on the coalface to deliver on the promise of levelling up. But as Richard said, unless it is done with some sort of czar is in charge of this, it isn't going to happen. But it needs to be holistic. It cannot just be piecemeal here and there. It needs to be an holistic approach combine central government and the regions to drive it through, not just another hot topic that disappears and in 10 years' time ago, whatever happens to that?
Exactly. Yeah, give it the credit and the sort of attention it requires. Just trying to bring this before we go to some of the audience questions, because obviously we're getting quite a few audience questions coming through as well, which is quite good. What at a local level then? So if you think of like local managers and local leaders, what might they be able to do to try to address some of these levelling up challenges, certainly around the skills gap we've already mentioned, and in particular with the CMI as well? What more can the CMI do to help support levelling up as well? I just wanted to take your views on that before we kind of turn more to the audience questions.
We're just kicking off. I mean, I think from a sort of managerial point of view, and again, it's driven by industry sector. I just think it's about retention and retraining, isn't it? I think that's so important. There was a Northern Powerhouse survey done up here, which, very much looked at 37% of the population over 50. Well, they are providing a massive annual contribution to GDP, yet can often be working in, in skills areas that become obsolete. And I think if you can, as a manager, look, or as a business, have retraining that will drag through and reposition those individuals into new careers within your business, you're getting an understanding of your business because they've been with you for a period of time, and you're also, garnering a large degree of loyalty. So I think, these sort of areas, when we do have the skills gaps, the technical skills gaps particularly, then, it's you can teach an old dog new tricks. Trust me, I occasionally learn them.
Excellent, thank you for that encouraging note, Steve. There, that's great. And to you, Richard, again, same question. What can we do at a local level here, and what more perhaps can us as the CMI as an organisation do to help support this?
I've got to say, I wholly agree with Steve. To me, it's all about stigma, isn't it? It's all about the traditional views. When you interview somebody, how many times do people make the same choices? Do they interview in the right way? Do they actually interview on the basis of competencies? Do they allow their preconceptions to get in the way? Now, I'm not saying it, but as a man who's 50, there's a perception or around my ability, I'm sure, if I applied for a job because of my age. It's removing those stigmas, and I use the word very carefully, because a lot of those people bring an awful lot of life experience and a capability of learning and retraining, as Steve said. So locally, I would say to managers, broaden your search, be open, look at the core competencies you actually truly require, not what you perceive, and interview against them correctly. And I think within the second part of your question, it's as you're educating the managers of the future, it's exactly the same. You educate them around that process, about how to interview correctly, how to train people, and how to not allow traditional limiting thoughts to get in the way. Because I think that's a lot of the problem we have. I could tell you numerous times working with certain sectors, they like to recruit people from the sector.
Yes.
Why? There's somebody who's doing Java development may not have worked in automotive. They may have worked in education. They could bring with them some ideas from a different sector. It's that sort of innate or inbuilt perception, I think, stops us and puts people on a pile of unusable when they're simply not. I think we've got to focus around that, and I think that's the job really for the managers of the future.
And I think just really picking up on that, sorry, Matt, I think, Rich absolutely nails it in terms of, particularly in our sector, particularly in the tech sector, the people who are making the real difference at the moment are the real free thinkers. People are skateboarding around offices and doing it all a little bit differently. Yeah, a very different world to the one that I came into. Quite funny when you turn up in a suit for a meeting with them and they're in shorts. But it is, as Rich said, we need the managers of the future need to. Not everybody needs to be thinking like that, but we need to start evolving and integrating new ideas into how we go about the process. And that particularly comes down to the recruitment part and the sort of path and the journey we can set people on. And I think by being sort of freer in thinking, it will allow that.
No, thank you very much, Dave. This again, Richard, as well, is really interesting and insightful. Sort of solutions towards this as well. It's really good to see coming through. I just wanted to turn to some of our audience questions now, because we've had sort of two groups. We had some pre-submitted questions, which are quite helpful, and we've obviously had a series of live questions throughout our conversation today that have come through. So I just want to pick a couple of pertinent ones to put to you. So again, just picking up on the last point, sort of a CMI member has put through sort of a statement here, and he's basically suggesting he or she was saying that this is a huge challenge, obviously, to the economy. But in terms of relative responsibilities, where do you see the difference being made between employers, government, professional bodies, etc., making this a success? So what part of the problem should different stakeholder groups take in terms of trying to resolve this? So you've got employers, you've got government, you've got professional bodies. Clearly, we all need to take collective responsibility, but any advice to who should do which bits, or who should prioritise on which areas first?
The government one, and I'm no government specialist, so but to me, it's about how you promote a behaviour, where you invest in, what you do to promote a behaviour. And if skill shortages have existed for years and years, which they have, if regional differences have existed for years and years, then it's time to change. Sure. And because the government, whatever they're spending on, or whatever they're focusing their investment in, it isn't necessarily working. There are good, or what's best practice? What is working? Is anybody looking at that? Because isn't the definition of madness doing the same thing over and over again? So, we need to not stop the bus necessarily, but we need to stop and think, right, okay, where do we spend as a government to promote the behaviours we need? And I'm sorry, I don't know. I can give some ideas, but I don't know the detailed answer. But what I do know is what we're doing at the moment isn't necessarily working, or it's only working in small pockets, and nobody's taking that data and using it properly.
Sure.
When it comes to employers, I think, as I've said, it's the removal of those traditional views, those traditional limiters. And as Steve said, when you've got a client who arrives down a slide into a reception, I'd have thought, it's a bit over the top, maybe some years ago. You've got to remove that, because this is the world we live in. And in many ways, you've got to listen to the younger generations of managers, and because they're more in tune, ideally, I suppose, with the people they're employing, etc. So at an employer level, remove the traditional stigmas and blockers. At government level, look at what you're investing in and stop doing the same thing over and over again.
No, great advice, Richard. Thank you.
Same again, promote into the right places and make your region have a real dedicated focus on your region. Make it attractive.
Excellent. No, wonderful. Thank you very much, Richard. And Steve, how about you on that question? Then, what advice would you give to these different bodies?
There's not a great deal else I can add to what Richard said there. I think we're coming over all a bit Dominic Cummings, aren't we? Ripping it all up and shredding it and throwing it all away. But no, I do. It's back to the sort of the running themes throughout this, which I think are genuine devolution. Industry, business body formation, and just really ripping up the rule book a little bit in terms of who we consider to be right for a role, what those roles are, and where we target the training of individuals, and set up training bodies accordingly. And if we need to reconsider the traditional approach to, particularly around the education side, then so be it, because as Rich said at the start of all of this, we are behind the curve a little bit, as a country. And this country is strong technically, absolutely strong technically, but we don't do it on a big enough scale. And I think we need to find some way of grabbing this sort of latent talent pool. It's a very creative country. You can see that in the arts. You can see it. With music, it's fantastic, and that is out there, and we need to somehow channel that into the areas that we're going to have future need.
Absolutely, no, I completely concur. We've had a really we've had several very fascinating, thought-provoking questions from our live audience right now. So I just want to pick up on a couple of them, if we're still okay. Certainly for time, I think we've got another sort of 10-ish minutes or so left. So Philip's asked a really interesting question here. So it would be interesting to hear what outcomes we believe collectively we want to achieve, and how will these demonstrate that we've achieved effectively levelling up? So in terms of outcomes then, if we think about what the end goal looks like, if we manage to achieve levelling up, I just wanted to sort of ask you on the spot there, what we think, what good looks like in terms of levelling up then. I don't know whether you've got any initial thoughts around that outcome-based question.
I think, I mean, diving in on this one, I think outcomes-wise, something that we were reading in prep for this. If you look at, for instance, where graduates stay post qualification, I think that the stats for London are double what they are for the Northwest, and I think the Northwest's about a third better than it is for the Midlands. That in itself has to be an indicator of where jobs are for high level grads. This area has some fantastic universities: Manchester, Liverpool, Lancaster, Chester, but so few graduates have the opportunities to stay on graduation. And I think that in itself is very much at the start of the piece in terms of a levelling up argument, but it would certainly indicate where opportunity lies. Personal experience, my niece was with us in the summer, graduated with a first from Nottingham, wanted to work in Manchester because she'd made good friends and she likes the area. Applied, clearly not the greatest time, but ended up with a job in St Paul's in London, and that kind of says it all. And she was delighted and has moved back to the south, but her preference was to remain. The opportunity didn't exist. So I think in answer to the question, that certainly would be one levelling up indicator.
No, that's great, Steve. Thank you very much for that. And Richard, again to you, what sort of outcomes do you think would describe levelling up as being achieved? I mean, again, we mentioned the election, didn't we, earlier in the conversation, and saying that in 3 to 4 years' time, whenever the next UK election is held, that perhaps Boris might not get his red wall potentially again if we haven't levelled up. So with that in mind, I mean, what sort of what does a good outcome look like from your view?
Well, I think if you looked at regional employment, you'd measure it on that, wouldn't you? There are all sorts of the traditional, which we don't need to mention, but you'd see a levelling of house prices, wouldn't you? Because people would want to be more, living in the Northwest. You'd see the average house price rises as the demand for housing rises. There's still clear regional differences in that. What would I like to see? I'd like to see employment. I'd like to see new industries and new sectors coming into those regions to, as we discussed, to spread the risk. That would show me that levelling up's working. More home working, that would be great to see. There'll be greater demands on. You'd see a migration of people from the major cities to the regions. So, and these are all things that you can measure, I suppose. So that to me would be a marker that we're moving in the right direction. Absolutely. And there's no reason it shouldn't. The opening of maybe specialist industry areas. Technology maybe, okay, that's fine, but you build a reputation in a certain region for a certain ability or a certain skill. Brilliant. That's what I'd be looking at. So you take your traditional let's say industrial, but there are other areas that are behind the curve, so to speak. But we would see a broadening of industry. We'd see house prices going up. We'd see investment in infrastructure. I think all of these are markers that would demonstrate that we're moving in the right direction.
No, thank you, Richard and Steve. So, unfortunately, we've only got time for one more question, and we've had so many questions. We're not sadly going to have to do another session, I think, to cover the remainder at a later date, hopefully. But one last question then. This is a question. I think it's from somebody called Suzwati. So, apologies in advance if I've got that pronunciation completely wrong there. So, take that one later. But the question is very, very interesting. So how can you level up on a budget? So obviously this question was potentially going back to a previous conversation we had about, say, apprenticeships and courses and things like that. And I suppose both from the student's perspective or the apprentice perspective, it can be quite an expensive undertaking perhaps, but also the employer's perspective, it could be, quite an expensive thing to put these skills workshops and things together. So what advice would you give finally for companies, businesses, SMEs, individuals on a limited budget? How do we sort of achieve this on a finite set of resources? Don't know who wants to go first on that. Steve, are you happy to go first on that?
I'll step in. It is difficult, and I mean it's going to be very much the theme of the moment, isn't it? But I think it's getting that path from education into business and getting a lifeblood into a business. And I think naturally salaries and training at that level are less than the retraining budget, which clearly a topic I touched on earlier, for more established individuals. But I think if businesses can look at putting aside some budget into training and bridging the gap at the bottom end, at the new end, if you like, then I think that will make such a considerable difference to school leavers who aren't necessarily holding the educational qualifications, aren't potentially academic, but there is a path where enthusiasm and initiative is as well thought as an exam. And I think if some budget can be dedicated towards that, that could provide a pathway into, and also be a relatively cost-effective way for businesses to approach it.
Really interesting, Steve. Thank you for that. And Richard, what would your advice be if we had a limited budget then for levelling up? What might we look to prioritise, perhaps?
Okay. I was looking at it in a different way.
No, go for it. Whichever way is better for you. Sorry.
Well, no, I was sat here considering the question because yes, we're all money and budget is so tight. I suppose my answer is that to successfully level up, a lot of this has got to be driven by investment and support from the government. It's got to come from there. And if we could take a percentage of the cost of the current bureaucracy, whatever your politics are, I'm sure we can save money in our processes in central government and then reinvest that and make that available to businesses that are currently struggling. Then they will assist us. So we need some financial support from government without any question.
Yeah.
Internally, yes, I do understand there's a requirement for courses, but I think it goes back to my point as a long in the tooth recruiter. We've got to remove, when we're interviewing candidates for potential opportunities, we've got to remove some of those limiting views, because we have an incredibly talented country, incredibly talented people, and the resource is out there. It is out there. So I think if we can possibly change how we interview or how we bring people into our businesses, it's not a short-term fix, but longer term, I don't think it's all about money.
Interesting. No, thank you both very much for all of the responses you've given. I suppose on the budget one, finally, we hope that Rishi Sunak, when he looks at the next budget forthcoming, possibly today, possibly later in the week, is considering levelling up in certainly that priority list of what he's got. But thank you both very much, Richard and Steve. I'm just going to pass now back to Jamil, who can help us wrap up. So thank you very much, everybody.
That's great. Thanks, Matt. So that's it for this afternoon's session. Thank you to everyone that's joined us this afternoon. And thank you very much to Steve, to Richard and to Matt for your insights and your expertise on today's topic. If you are a member of CMI, you can log into Management Direct using the link in the live chat box, where you can find thousands of exclusive practical development resources and much, much more. And if you've not yet subscribed, why not join our community via the link that's also in the live chat box. And you can also sign up for the free CMI newsletter. Plus, via the link in the live chat box, you can visit the CMI West Midlands and North West Regional Board's webpage. And from there, you can connect with the board's LinkedIn group, where you can also continue today's discussion, which we very much hope you've enjoyed. So thank you very much again for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.